Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we sail out of the Adriatic Sea and the remains of the Roman Empire and into the Ionian Sea and the remains of the Greek Empire. Their civilization was called Hellas, and it lasted from the Greek Dark Ages, probably around the 12th century BCE, until the end of classical antiquity in the 6th century AD. At its height, from the 4th through the 1st centuries BCE, and after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Hellenistic civilization spread throughout the Western Mediterranean all the way to Central Asia. Nothing lasts forever, not humans, cultures, and certainly not empires. The Hellenistic period ended with the Roman Republic's conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Unlike some modern conquering armies, the Romans didn't think to obliterate Greek culture, language, art, and architecture. In fact, they admired it. The two families of the gods, some Roman and some Greek, duplicated one another. The Romans absorbed much of it, meaning that the Greeks to some extent represented the underpinnings of Roman culture and architecture. Today we're going to take a look at the ruins of one of classical Greece's most famous religious sites. It was a sanctuary, one of several, in this case dedicated to the king of the gods, Zeus. We'll start with the sanctuary area today, where the Greeks located their temples. Next week, we'll take a look at what I think of as the modern Olympic village, 8th century BCE style. You don't have to be able to run a marathon or put on sneakers or throw a discus. Just kick back and relax with me while we visit Olympia, today on The Armchair Traveler. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we sail out of the Adriatic Sea and the remains of the Roman Empire and into the Ionian Sea and the remains of the Greek Empire. Their civilization was called Hellas, and it lasted from the Greek Dark Ages, probably around the 12th century BCE, until the end of classical antiquity in the 6th century AD. At its height, from the 4th through the 1st centuries BCE, and after the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Hellenistic civilization spread throughout the Western Mediterranean all the way to Central Asia. Nothing lasts forever, not humans, cultures, and certainly not empires. The Hellenistic period ended with the Roman Republic's conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Unlike some modern conquering armies, the Romans didn't think to obliterate Greek culture, language, art, and architecture. In fact, they admired it. The two families of the gods, some Roman and some Greek, duplicated one another. The Romans absorbed much of it, meaning that the Greeks to some extent represented the underpinnings of Roman culture and architecture. Today we're going to take a look at the ruins of one of classical Greece's most famous religious sites. It was a sanctuary, one of several, in this case dedicated to the king of the gods, Zeus. We'll start with the sanctuary area today, where the Greeks located their temples. Next week, we'll take a look at what I think of as the modern Olympic village, 8th century BCE style. You don't have to be able to run a marathon or put on sneakers or throw a discus. Just kick back and relax with me while we visit Olympia, today on The Armchair Traveler. My name is Judy, and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. If you're enjoying my content, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your help means more people will see my content. If you want more information, I have a WordPress blog, a page on Facebook, and a Twitter handle. The addresses are here or in the information block at the bottom of the screen. Thank you and enjoy your visit. Seen from above, this aerial photograph gives you some idea of the extent of the site, which is still being excavated and documented. The area was first used as a religious site. It was eventually transformed into the site of the original Olympic Games, and only fell into disuse during the Byzantine period of the Roman Empire. The ancient sanctuary was originally surrounded by walls on three sides and bordered by Mount Kronos, the hill to the north, shown on the left in this image. We'll enter the site as Olympic athletes and viewers of the Games might have done in 776 BCE when the Games began. The sanctuary here dates back to at least 1000 BCE, although there were almost certainly people here for another millennia before that time. The sanctuary probably developed some fairly simple religious structures and an open space. The buildings might even have been of wood. and quite a bit of it has been identified. Without a drawing like this one, however, it's pretty hard to imagine what the place must have looked like in its prime, when it was stuffed full of buildings, facilities, altars, temples, and more, including hotels and training grounds catering to the athletes as well as to the visitors. The Olympic Games began in 776 BCE and continued every 4 years, with the exception of one date which was moved up to suit Roman Emperor Nero Claudius Caesar. Nero, if you didn't know, was actually one of the bad Caesars. There's a structure here on the grounds that's called the House of Nero, which might or might not have had anything to do with him. History tells us that Nero, who thought he could do anything better than anyone else, was keen to participate not just as an observer, but as a competitor. In 67 AD, the games were actually held out of time sequence, 2 years ahead of time, to match up with the emperor's tour of this part of Greece. The story is that Nero actually did compete as a charioteer in a race. He didn't win. Apparently he had a 10-horse chariot and he couldn't control it, got dumped from his basket, injured, and lost. Even so, he declared himself to be the winner. This map, courtesy of Wikipedia, gives you an idea of the layout of the full site. The sanctuary area was roughly rectangular and sits just north of what had been a huge colonnade called the South Stoa, which is how visitors would have approached the site, so we will too. It's time for us to move into the ancient sanctuary. The first stop for visitors may have been right here at what's called the South Stoa. This was the southern boundary of the sanctuary and had a double row of columns, probably roofed over. It was a reception area and how people would have made their way from the athletes' and visitors' quarters into the religious site. This is the obliterate, which obviously isn't a Greek word. It was an important government building, although not part of the religious sanctuary. The Greeks had legislatures, and this was an assembly house for the local legislature. It was a nice, large building and looked a bit like a large square horseshoe, at least to me. Construction began in the 6th century BCE. The Temple of Zeus was a primary religious site here in the sanctuary. This temple started out as new construction, not a repurposing of an older building, in the 5th century BCE. Zeus was the king of the Olympian gods, and this temple was designed as a spot where he could be properly worshipped and where people could ask for favors. Even in ruins, it mostly fell down during an earthquake. It remains impressive to this day. Visitors would have trudged here to Olympia from hundreds of miles away, either to worship here at the sanctuary or to participate in the games. The temples in Olympia were made mostly out of local limestone, and what was available was not of great quality. The better quality big pieces had to be reserved for areas that had to be built in one section. Buildings that could be built in smaller sections, like the columns, were created in pieces called drums, stacked one on top of another to form the pillar. Since the stone was so badly flawed, the masons covered over the finished product with stucco to make it look a lot more like marble, and history tells us they painted much of it. The roof is interesting as well. I was told that it was roofed with marble tiles cut thin enough to be translucent, so that on a hot summer's day, light would shine through to the interior of the temple. These two artist renderings give you an idea of some of the detail of the building. The site sits somewhat uphill from the stadium, which accounts for how visitors noted that they could look downhill toward that site. The building had a central inner area called a naxos, with columns on 4 sides, creating an open colonnade which would let in light and air and provided a covered walkway for the worshippers. While the temple, of course, didn't survive, Greek archaeologists have managed to salvage and reconstruct the 2 pediments, the triangular areas over the openings on the 2 short ends of the building. This is the eastern pediment, and it shows us the tale of a king named Pelops just before a chariot race, wherein he kills another king in order to win the hand of his daughter. The story might have been about a chariot race, but Zeus, who presided over the race, is shown in the center. He's the headless figure, and he always took precedent. These beautiful sculptures are now protected in the Olympia Archaeological Museum. Since this temple was dedicated to the king of the gods, Zeus, it's not surprising to find out that there was a seated statue of the man about 41 feet tall, made by a Greek sculptor named Phidias around 435 BCE. We'll learn a lot more about Phidias when we visit his studio, located just outside the sanctuary in our next walk of the Olympic Village. We don't have the statue today or any parts of it that I know of. It apparently disappeared sometime in the 5th century, but even so, we know quite a bit about it. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The statue was built of thinly sliced ivory applied over a wooden frame, then decorated with gold leaf. Zeus was shown seated on a painted cedar throne, ornamented with ebony, ivory, gold, and possibly precious stones. The statue was lost and destroyed before the end of the 6th century AD, with conflicting accounts about the date and circumstances. This statue set a style or model that persisted at least until the beginning of the American Republic. The statue you see here of George Washington by Horatio Greenenough in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. bears more than a passing resemblance to the original. The Pelopian is a 5-sided building with an entrance, and it's quite different from the other buildings in the area. This was a monument and tomb of King Pelops, who we met when we took a look at the pediment. Hardly anything remains here except some foundation stones, just enough to trip over, but the signboard gives you some idea of the layout. The 5-sided enclosure was filled with piled-up cinders and ashes collected from offerings to the gods. The Philippion is a circular monument, quite different from the others in the area, and actually built out of marble and limestone. It's one of the most striking remains here in the sanctuary, and to my eye, because enough of it has been set upright, you can actually see what it looks like. This was constructed in celebration of Philip of Macedon's victory in Chaeronea in 338 BCE. It's the only structure inside the sacred area dedicated to a human being instead of a god. That human was Philip of Macedonia, who included his family. Philip converted his inherited small kingdom into the most powerful in Greece, using both diplomacy when he could and war when diplomacy failed. His son, Alexander the Great, followed him and conquered vast territories. In its day, this monument had ivory and gold leaf figures of Philip and his family, which included Philip himself, his son Alexander the Great, Olympias, who was Philip's wife and Alexander's mother, and Netus III, who was Philip's father, and Eurydice I, who was Philip's mother. Who commissioned the memorial? Was it Philip himself? It's certainly possible. From what I've read, the man had an ego as big as his empire, and all the figures do tie to him. But some students think that Alexander actually built it to emphasize his role as Philip's rightful heir. The Meltron is a small temple located just north of the large Temple of Hera, which will be our next stop. As you can see, the available signage is a huge help in understanding the building. This building was dedicated to a woman said to be the mother of the gods, who is also called Cybele. Her worship started in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and she was known all over the Greek city-states. Much later, Roman storytellers reinvented her as the ancestral goddess of the Trojans. The Temple of Hera is the oldest one here in the sanctuary, and was initially a joint temple dedicated to her in her role as queen of the Greek gods, and her brother or husband, Zeus, as king. Later on, Zeus got his own temple. The building went up around 590 BCE and might initially have been partially built out of wood. The sidewise view shows you how the temple is raised up above ground level. The temple had a peristyle running all the way around it, an anteroom called the pronaos, a central area called the naos, and a rear storage area with a name that I cannot pronounce. Somewhat surprisingly, at least to me, was the fact that I've never been able to find a model of what this temple looked like, just some line drawings. I think we can assume that, like the later temple of Zeus, the masonry was plastered over and brightly painted. Although we don't know exactly what it looked like, at least one of the decorations from the interior, a beautiful statue of Hermes and the infant Dionysus, has been rediscovered. This statue, now safely stored in the archaeological museum I mentioned earlier, was unearthed in 1877 in the ruins of the temple. We have an eyewitness account by a 2nd century Greek traveler named Pausanias, who saw it then and said it was carved by Praxiteles and dates from the 4th century BCE. Pausanias was an interesting guy. He was a Greek, likely from somewhere in modern-day Turkey, who spent the last 30 years of his life sightseeing all over the mainland of Greece. He didn't take photographs, of course, and apparently didn't make drawings, but he wrote down what he saw. often getting off track explaining the myths and the rituals associated with the sites. He sounds a bit like your armchair traveler, except he didn't have a camera. Scholars will argue about the name of the sculptor until the end of time, or until there's no such thing as a master's thesis or a PhD dissertation to be written. No matter who carved it, it's truly beautiful. The statue shows us Hermes, the messenger of the god, holding up an infant named Dionysus, who was the god of wine and parties. This was carved out of Parian marble, not the local limestone. The island where the marble was mined is close to 300 miles from here, so the material must have been imported and had to have been expensive. You've seen it used before, most likely, if you've ever seen a picture of the Venus de Milo, which was carved of the same stone. The discovery of the statue has posed a tangled question for historians and curious travelers ever since. What did these things look like in their prime? While quite beautiful in the carved and highly polished form we see here, they look quite different in their time, when both the Greeks and later Romans slathered everything with paint. At the time of its discovery, the hair had slight traces of a chemical called cinnabar, which had a red color. Whether it was there as a coloration for the statue or in preparation for gilding, we don't know. However, cinnabar was commonly used for a coloring agent. We've walked our feet off today, and when I visited it was under a hot Greek sun, so I think it's time for us to call a halt. My overall impression of the sanctuary was that the authorities here have done a great job at excavating and preserving the site, complete with some signage, although more would be helpful. I've learned that the digging and research is ongoing. This was a substantial area in its time, capable of accommodating thousands of visitors, at least temporarily, for the games, and included not just Greek, but later Roman and Byzantine elements. Today, most of it is just the footprints of those buildings, sometimes, I think, still covered over by grass, and even today overrun by the olive trees. I'm quite sure there's more to be discovered. Unfortunately, times change, and so do fortunes. Olympia lies in what's called a seismically active zone, with several known and probably other unmapped fault lines. But the city wasn't destroyed just by an earthquake, although that's what finished it off. The area was eventually conquered by the Romans, and it's pretty common to find Roman imperial-era buildings, typically their basilicas, which were law courts, still standing and incorporated to this day into post-empire Christian churches and sometimes city halls. That isn't what happened here. The Roman emperors at the time pursued a different course. Roman Emperor Theodosius II ordered the temples in Olympia to be destroyed in 426 CE. He wanted to outlaw pagan worship in the area, and to do so destroyed the locations where it took place. He left the temples of Zeus and Hera in ruins. In 522, and then 30 years after that, a pair of earthquakes damaged the remains even more. By this time, the area had long been abandoned. Next, mudslides and silt from the Claudius River on the western edge of the site eventually covered over what was left, and people forgot it was even here. The site was rediscovered 1,200 years later, in 1766, by an English archaeologist, and started to be explored in the 1800s by both French and German archaeologists. Olive trees, possibly seeded from the giants that must have been in the area before the disaster, spread out freely and can be found to this day. So can extremely tame cats, to the joy of some and annoyance of others. Come back next week for a visit to the world's first Olympic village, right here in Olympia with me, the Armchair Traveler.